Hi, I'm Scott Hanselman, and I'm here with Damien Edwards. And we are continuing our walkthrough of a real live ASP.NET 5 application that is in production. Specifically, it is live.asp.net. When we last left our hero, we were looking at how we get the data to show on live.asp.net. In this case, we're not using a database per se. We're using two things. We're using Azure Storage for some small things, and we'll look at that. But we're also using YouTube. It doesn't really matter that we're using YouTube, but we're using is a web API, an external web API, and that is our storage.
Absolutely.
So let's take a look at where we were in our code.
So I'm back here in my index method in the home controller. So this is what gets hit when the home page is hit. And this
is called home. Yeah, this is home index, just like
home index,
just like what we saw before.
Just like we saw before. Yeah. So I've got two services in my application that are providing data. One is the live show details, and that's the one that is persisting to Azure Storage. And then I have the show list, which is previous episodes that were recorded, and that one currently is implemented to pull that list from a YouTube playlist. So let's go and have a look at the YouTube code, because as Scott pointed out, that's actually using a web API. So here I am in my YouTube shows service.
Did you write this code?
I wrote this code, yes.
Okay.
Yep. And so this is just a standard class that I wrote that implements an interface that I wrote. We have a quick look at the interface. It's pretty simple. It's an asynchronous method that returns a list of shows. Okay.
Right.
Task of show list.
Get some shows. You do pass in a user.
I pass in a user and I pass in a disable cache flag. We'll have a little look at what that's for as we look at the implementation. If I have a look at the show list, it's pretty straightforward. It has a string property, which is a URL to see more shows, and then a list of shows that I want to show on the home page.
So on the current home page, we have a grid full of shows, and then at the very bottom, there's more shows.
Right.
And in our example, it just sends you off to the YouTube playlist.
Correct.
Right?
Yep.
Okay.
And for each show, we provide an ID, the name of the provider, and the provider ID. So the provider in this case would be YouTube, and the provider ID is the ID that YouTube assigns to this show. Then I have a title. What is the title of the show? I have a helper property that tells me whether it has a title or not. We talked a little bit about that in the last module. That prevents me from having to do code like this throughout my view.
Okay.
I have a description, which is a description for the show, if there is one. The date that show took place. Another helper property that tells me whether that show is new. So that's a little bit of business logic that's embedded in this model. If it's not in the future, and the show was less than 7 days ago, then I consider the show new. I determine if it's in the future, if was the show date greater than now. Okay,
right.
Simple as that. Because I reuse this model for the list of previous shows as well as the current show. And then I have a URL to the show and a URL for a thumbnail image of the show. So if we go back to the code that actually loads this stuff up, as I said, this is just a class that I wrote. A couple of fields up here that we'll use. I inject a bunch of services from my application's container that we looked at in the last module and how that was being set up. So I have my app settings class, which is settings to do with my application. I have a memory cache instance, which is a memory cache is an interface provided by ASP.NET that allows you to store or cache information in memory on this web server. And then I have my telemetry client, which is the class provided by Application Insights that lets me do custom telemetry logging. And so I mentioned that in the last module that I'm using this to time and count the details around my calls out to YouTube, so I can see how long it takes.
And you're just doing that for yourself, or are you presenting that to the user?
I'm doing that for myself. So that's used so that when I go to the Azure portal to look at the performance of this website, I can see how many times did I call YouTube in the last day, and how long did that time take on average. Because I'm using cache here, I don't want to hit YouTube every single time someone loads the site, because that would require their browser to hit my website, and then my website would have to go off to YouTube, get that data, come back, and there'd be that sort of 3-layered trip. I know that the list of shows doesn't really change often. It only changes once a week when we do a show. So there's no point making that call every single time. So I'm going to put the results in memory cache, and then I'm going to time and count the number of times I do make that call so that I can potentially find issues in my code. Maybe if I see that I'm calling out to YouTube 10 times a day and I don't expect that, I'd be able to go and investigate why.
And is it just because you're a good programmer that you knew to do that, or why didn't you just have like some internal telemetry where you kept that number yourself and you watched that?
Well, if I kept the number myself, I'd still have to display it somewhere. So I could choose to perhaps display it on the admin screen. But because I'm hosting this in Azure, I wanted to try and use a lot of the features available to me. And one of those features is the application insight service, which enables me to see this type of data in a nice, graphical way. I can configure alerts so that I can get alerted when thresholds are passed and those type of things. I also originally had a bug in my application where the cache wasn't being used correctly. And so I had my cache key was incorrectly figured in my code. It was just a standard bug in my code. I'd made a mistake. I deployed it to production. And then overnight, one night, I noticed in the portal that I had an exception. And the exception was as a result of YouTube rate limiting me.
Really? So
yes.
YouTube noticed you're calling us too often.
Right.
Please stop.
Please stop. And that was like, oh, I must have a problem in my code because I know I'm only supposed to be calling it once a day. At that point, I added the telemetry, I found the bug in my memory cache, and I've left the telemetry in there so that if ever that happens again, I'll very quickly be able to tell if that was the problem.
Which is a good reminder to everyone that when you are writing software like this, measuring is just so important.
Measuring is absolutely important. And over time, as you write more and more applications, you start just to do these type of things by default. So I knew I was going to host this in Azure. I knew that we were going to run this as a live site, so I wanted to have this extra type of information available to me. And I wanted to use the product and feel and get a feeling for how it worked in ASP.NET, because part of my job is making sure ASP.NET is awesome. So I wanted to make sure it actually felt good. So that's my constructor. I pull in those services and I store them on field so that I can use them later on. Nothing particularly interesting there so far. Then I have my actual method that does the work, the one that implements the interface that I need to satisfy in order to get data. So what do? Well, first of all, I say if I don't have a app setting, which is the YouTube API key. So the YouTube API key is a secret value that you set up with YouTube when you configure an application through the Google portal. And you use that to make calls to YouTube via their web API.
Okay.
So if I don't have that thing configured in my application, then I just use design data. So you can see here I say return new show, I just short circuit. Return new show list, shows is equal to design data.shows. I have a hard-coded list of shows at the bottom of this class that I can use to do layout testing, fiddle with Bootstrap, that type of stuff without having to hit YouTube every time.
So in this case, though, you said if the API key is null, could you have said if I was in development or if I'm not in production? I mean,
could have.
You can use different bits of information to decide whether it's appropriate.
Yeah, and then similar to what we did in the last module, I decided to light up or not based on the presence of the thing that I needed to make that call, rather than trying to make an assumption that, well, if I'm in this environment, I'm always going to want to use local data.
Right.
That's not necessarily true.
And you called that feature detection.
I called that feature detection, like we do in the browser when we look at a JavaScript API and make sure it's there before we call it.
Right.
I'm going to check, do I have a YouTube API key before I then go off and actually try to call YouTube? Because if I don't, it's not going to work. It also is a little bit of a look into how this site progressed. When I first started this show, when I first started building this website, I didn't have the YouTube code.
Right.
I started out laying out the front page. I knew what I wanted the show to look like, so I started out laying out the front page and I needed some data. So I built this class and the service, and all this method did in the first day was return hard-coded data. And I sort of had this concept of design data from day one, and then when I got that working and I was happy with the layout, only then did I go and add the code to talk to YouTube.
That's actually a really good idea. I could see someone sitting down and saying, I'm going to make this wonderful thing that talks to YouTube, and they could spend a whole lot of time fighting with YouTube and really trying to get an understanding of that, and forgetting that you don't want to put the cart before the horse.
Absolutely.
And just let's get this new layout with the data that we think we'll be able to have.
And in the beginning, like I said, we only update the show once a week. So even if I couldn't get the YouTube data to work in the day that I wanted to, I could just manually add the show details. We saw the show class, it has 7 or 8 properties. I could have deployed that and been happy for 3 or 4 days. No one would know the difference while I continued to work on the YouTube data aspect of it.
That's a good point.
So, so if it's design, if I don't have that, I return design data. Next, I have a check to say, now this is why I'm using that user principle. If I have an authenticated user, now we said before, the only people who are authenticated in this application are you, me, and John.
Right.
So I know if someone is authenticated and they've passed in the disable cache flag, then just call get shows list. That's the one that actually talks to YouTube, which we'll look in a minute. And don't go through this logic down here, which tries to get it out of cache.
So you said the disable cache flag. Where does that come from? The URL?
So if I go back to my home controller, you'll see that in the index method,
it's optional.
There's a disable cache bool that's optional. That will be bound from the query string using model bounding. Okay, and so you can pass a disable cache equals true to the home page, and it will say, hey, please don't use the cache. That's passed straight through into that API. But we only support that for authenticated users.
All right.
Because I don't want random people being able to force my app to make YouTube calls rather than use the cache. So let's jump back here. So we say if you're authenticated and you've said please disable cache, then go ahead and call out to YouTube. Otherwise, I'm going to first check in the memory cache, which is my underscore cache variable here, which I set up in my constructor. Please get from the memory cache the show list object, or something typed by show list, using this cache key. Now the cache key is just a field. If I navigate to that, it's at the top of this class, and I've just set it to be the name of this class.
Okay.
So nothing special there. It's just a consistent string that will never change that I use to identify cache in this application.
And I have to say, though, that for people who maybe aren't thinking about this as an intro, but maybe more advanced people, there's a lot of great little tips in here.
I hope so, yeah.
And I think like the name of, it may seem obvious to you, but it's like, oh yeah, I have a tendency to just hard code the string.
And that's
much nicer.
That's a new C# feature, which I'm using as well. Like previously that would have just been a string. Now I don't have to worry about refactoring. It's just the name of the class.
That's great.
So then I grab something that, I try and get that out of cache. If that is null, I do the actual work. So then I call that same method, return await get shows list, which will get the shows from YouTube, which we'll look at in a minute. Once I have that result, I set it in the cache. Using that cache key, that same value, set this thing, and then pass in some options, which include when do I want that to expire.
So an absolute expiration relative to now, nice and clear.
You can see there's different options.
Right,
here.
I could say expired on Tuesdays.
Right.
But instead you're just saying it a day from the last time it was null.
Basically, yeah. Expiration relative to now. So just 1 day from now.
Very
and
cool.
I could choose to make that later. I could choose to make that configurable, but I just don't really have any need to do that in this application. So it's just set to 1 day. Once I've set that in the cache, I can then just return that result, and that will be returned back to the controller. So let's actually jump right in now to how I'm calling out to YouTube. So let's go down to this private method that actually does the crux of the work. This is the one that actually calls out to YouTube.
Here's the meat here.
Here's the meat. So I am using...
And I want to point out, this is private, right? This is...
Private method.
This is in a service. This is not something that we can call from the outside.
No.
And this here, if I understand correctly, is why the controller is so thin.
Yes, absolutely. So the controller is thin because it just says, hey, go to this service and call get shows. The meat of get shows is in this class, and it's actually in this method. Because we're doing this caching, I need to be able to sometimes return it without caching and other times return it with caching. So this actual logic is factored into its own method here. So this is an asynchronous method. Most of these are async. And get shows list. I use the YouTube service. Now this one is not something I wrote.
You did not write that.
This is me taking a dependency on the Google.net API. I added the NuGet package to my application, and they provide the YouTube service. And this is the .NET class that I can use to call out to YouTube to do certain things. In this case, I'm going to get the items from a playlist. And this is how you use it. Create a new YouTube service. You have to pass in one of these initializer classes where you pass in your YouTube application name and your secret YouTube API key.
And you have that in app settings, but it's coming out of secrets.
Yes, so
or the environment.
Yeah, or the environment. So I'm flowing it through my application in this app settings class that I created. That app settings class is being populated by the configuration system, and the configuration system is being populated from either a config file, my user secret store, or environment variables if I'm running in production. So this value is coming from somewhere. This code has no idea where the value is coming from. It doesn't need to know. It just needs to know that there is a value. Once I've got my client up and running, I can start making requests. So I say, here's my list request. I say client.playlistitems.list. You have to pass in what type of data you want to get. So when you make a call to YouTube, you can say, what part of the data do you want? They have a pre-canned one called snippet, which pretty much gives you everything you'd want to know about a playlist item so you can build the type of page I'm building.
That's, again, specific to YouTube.
Specific to the YouTube API. I just read their docs and I passed in the snippet string here. I then have to give it the playlist ID. So that's the playlist ID on your account currently. And that is, again, coming from my app settings. That's not secret. You see that in the URL when you go there.
Right.
And then I say, how many results do I want to return as the maximum when I make this request? They have a default value, which I think is 20 or 25.
Right.
But because my home page is laid out in rows of 3 items, I said I want 8 rows of 3 items.
Purely a aesthetic
purely an aesthetic thing, that is directly tied to how I want it to lay out on the home screen. I don't want to return any more data than is required, and I don't want to have to make 2 calls to get 2 pages of data to fill my home screen. So I just set it to say, please give me this number of results.
And you also made an arbitrary decision to, when you go to the bottom of the page and you click show more,
Correct.
you could have done paging.
I could have
requested for more, but really send them off to the playlist. There could be hundreds someday.
Absolutely, exactly. I decided that showing 24 on the homepage was enough, and anything beyond that they can go off to the source. So then I say, okay, this little bit of code here is the code to track how long it's going to take me to do this call and to actually make the call itself.
So this is
so I can separate these out to make them a little clearer.
This is a specific concept about App Insights.
Yes.
And YouTube Playlist Items API, that's just a key that you've told them about.
Correct. And so this call here, line 83, is where I actually make the call to YouTube. Here's my list request. I call execute async, and I get back to playlist items. Before I did that, I grabbed the current time. So I'm saying the request starts now, at this point here, line 81. Okay. Then I make the request, and then immediately after that, I call into my telemetry and say, please track a dependency. YouTube.playlist items API, that's something I created. That's just the name that I gave it. I want the name of the operation that I want you to track is called list. Again, that's just arbitrary data that I'm choosing to pass to the telemetry API so that when it's viewed in the portal, it has some nice name. So I'm listing things from the YouTube playlist items API. I pass in the date time that it started, which I captured in line 81, and then I pass in how long it took by getting the current time and taking away the time it started. There's standard date math. And then the last structure here is indicating that the result succeeded. Now, if I wanted to, I could put a try catch around this. And in my catch, I could choose to track a different item in telemetry where that is set to false. I haven't done that yet. At the moment, it very, very rarely fails, so I just haven't seen the need to do that. But if I wanted to be really, really sort of tight with this code, I could choose to actually track when it fails as well. I just haven't done that at the moment. So now that I have my playlist items in a variable here after executing the request, I'm going to build out the model, the actual items that I return to my rest of my application. I'm not returning the YouTube data directly because, as we said before, we may change this from using YouTube to a different video service at some point in the future, and I only want to have to change one class when that takes place. I just want to create a new implementation of this show service class. I don't want to have a different object type go through to my controller and then a different object type go through to my view, which would result in all types of files having to change in my application. I am componentizing this down to this one class. So I create my show list, which is my type, and then I project from the playlist items, which were returned by YouTube, into my show type on my show list by doing a link query. So I say, for every item that was returned by YouTube, please select me a new show which has all these properties set to data from YouTube.
Is this what they call a projection?
This is a projection, yeah. So I'm projecting from the YouTube data type that was returned by their service into my data type. This is mine.
So show could also be called show view model.
It could. Well, it could be. It's not the show. The show actually goes on to the view model.
This is a great point.
Yeah.
So I thought that because I'm used to putting things in my controller.
Right.
But there's nothing specific about MVC
nothing
in
at
this
all.
service.
No.
I could write a Windows application.
Correct.
That used this, or a mobile application that used this, which
Correct.
is another reason why it's so nice that you've refactored this.
Yeah. Now, if we look over where this show class actually lists,
this is actually a domain model.
It's in my models folder. It's not in my view models folder. It's in my models folder. So the show is just a POCO. It's just a plain old CLR object, right? It's just the class that has properties. It has no logic. It knows nothing about views. It knows nothing about controllers. Whereas view models, as you said before, I designed specifically to be used from Razor.
I see. So these are domain models that are specifically to be used by people who are interested in your service.
Correct.
That may then be transformed into view models that
Correct.
are specific to a view.
Absolutely.
So it's getting more and more specific and specialized as it gets closer and closer to the user.
Yes.
Depending on who your user is.
Absolutely. So in this case, when we look at YouTube data, there's really 3 from the time that we get the data from YouTube to the time it hits the pixels sort of in your browser. There's kind of 3 models here. There's the one that the YouTube service returns. That's this item right here. It's of type Google APIs YouTube v3 data.playlist item.
Right.
There's the show class, which is my model. Then there is the show list, that the show goes onto, and then the show list is returned by the controller and placed into a view model, like the home view model or the admin view model, and then the view binds to that view model and then iterates over it to render out the HTML. So what's interesting here? So we have a provider ID. I just take the information from the data that was returned. Title. So you can see here, title, I'm calling out to get useful bits from title. So I have this oddly
I love that you named that.
Yeah, I like to name my methods
Just
in
get
plain
the useful
English.
bits.
Get the useful bits, right?
So one of the things that you and I agreed upon was that we would come up with some kind of a format of the titles. We had historically said ASP.NET Community Stand-Up hyphen the date hyphen some title.
Interesting thing about the title.
And it was just to be tidy so that it would sort well.
Yes.
And in fact, I misspelled the word community last week,
Right.
which then caused some problems because it did not show up in my playlist and caused a delay.
Right. So I can show you what that means. If we go back over to the site, and I scroll down to the bottom, we can see these titles here. They're all different, right? They all have, say, something meaningful. But if I click on See More Episodes, see that all these titles here, the source data has more information in the title. It says ASP.NET Community Stand-Up space hyphen space some date space hyphen space, then the actual interesting bits of the title, which is what this method does. It takes this raw title and looks for those hyphens and then just grabs the bit after the last hyphen. It's as simple as that. So if we look at that method, we can see that. It says, well, if the title doesn't have two hyphens, then just return empty. If this is not the expected format, I'm going to show no title because I have no idea what's in there. Right? We agreed on this format, so I'm going to err on the side of safety.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that. So if I fail to put in the second hyphen,
correct,
don't give a title, it won't show up.
It won't show up at all because remember we talked about the layout of the home page. If I get too much information in that title, it breaks the layout. You have to think about how the layout, the content will affect the layout of the homepage. Now, I could probably fix that with a little bit more CSS. I could set it to truncate titles and those type of things, but that can look ugly. I just chose to say, nope, if the title doesn't fit, don't show the title. We'll see it very quickly and we can go and fix the source. Then I find where the last hyphen is, and then I start, if that last hyphen is in a position that's greater than or equal to 0, then I get the substring of that title from that position plus 1, and then I return that as my result. Very, very simple method that just does some string math, basically. So then I grab the description, I build a show date by parsing the published at raw field. So you can see here that this is a field that's given to me by YouTube.
Right.
And it says the date and time that the item was added to the playlist. The value is specified in ISO 8601, which is a universal standard, and in .NET it's known as the round-trippable standard.
Right.
So if you do a two-string R, it's the round-trip format, it's this standard here.
We call that a culture invariant or culture non-specific date.
Correct.
It's not like there's that great map that shows the map of the world with all of the countries that say month, day, year, and it's just the U.S.
It's just the U.S. Yes.
This is a safe date time to
This
parse.
is the safe time, and you can see here it's year, month,
Now,
day,
why
day.
is it date time offset?
So date time offset is used more often now throughout the framework. So you'll see that modern APIs tend to use date time offset because date time offset is considered superior in some ways in fixing some of the problems that exist with the original date time class. Now they are interchangeable in some ways,
right?
But if you're starting afresh, generally it's recommended that if you're just going to stick to the types in the framework, you use date time offset. Some customers will choose to use an external library, something like NotaTime, if they have very specific requirements to do very accurate and the sort of date parsing and that type of stuff. So I want to build a date time offset by parsing that raw string and putting it onto my view model. So I'm doing that here. That format is also UTC time as well. So there's no time zone specific. It's universal time or GMT, depending.
And this is particularly important to get date time correct because we've got daylight savings time and times are moving, and people really, for some reason, really want to see the live stream.
We saw very strong feedback when we first put the site up that they would really like to see the next show date in their local time. And so I did a lot of work. It took me about 37 commits to get that right, because doing that type of date math is difficult, especially when I'm dealing with server date times from an external service, and then the date time that my server itself is running in versus the date time the browser is running in. So you have to choose where to do that date math, where it's easiest for you and what makes most sense. What I ended up doing, and this is generally the golden rule, is you always store and work with dates in UTC. and then you only convert them to a local time when necessary to display them, and you try and do that as close to the pixels as possible, as close to the user. So in my case, I send the dates down to the browser in UTC, and then I convert them to the local time using JavaScript in the browser.
That's really interesting. I like you keep saying close to the pixels. We used to call that on the glass integration.
On the glass, yes.
The idea being that if you're making assumptions on the server side about what your time zone is, or if you have an application that changes its behavior because you changed the time on the machine itself, you changed the time zone.
Right.
I actually had a machine once on a system I worked on that had to be in Thailand's time zone.
Yep.
Because somebody made an assumption somewhere, and no matter where it lived in the world, it
Yep.
had to be in Thailand's
Yep.
time zone.
Absolutely.
Bad idea. Universal everywhere, and then right at the moment when you know the user's time,
Correct.
you convert it.
Now, in a web application, the only part of your app that knows the user's time without adding user profiles in a database to store that is the browser. Like, your server doesn't know what time Scott's computer is when he's using a browser to talk to.
And there's no effective way to guess that.
There's no effective way to guess that. You can attempt to try and guess it using things like geolocating the IP address,
Yep.
or looking at the culture name that gets sent up, or the language, the accept language header. Both of those things are imperfect, and generally they'll be wrong. Generally, the only right way to do it if you want to do this calculation on the server is to ask the user, what time zone do you want me to show you times for, and then persist that data. It's really the only way to do it correctly. So I just chose to ignore all that because I don't want people to have to sign in to the homepage just to see it in their local time zone. I send it down in UTC, and I do the stuff in JavaScript. JavaScript has the APIs to take a UTC time and convert it into a local time string relevant to the operating system settings and all those type of things.
How complicated was that?
It took me quite a few commits to get that right.
Is it a lot of lines of code?
I can show you the lines of code because it is kind of relevant. So everything on the server is done in UTC. We'll see that here. Okay, everything here is just UTC. You don't really have to worry about that. Let's go and have a look at the code in JavaScript that deals with that in the client. So here's my JavaScript code. Let me quickly show you how I show it in the home page so you can see where I'm getting the data. So here's the home screen. If it is on air,
Right.
we do the Hangout embed. And then for the next show scheduled, I pass in, you can see here, I'm passing in the UTC values into my HTML using data dash attributes.
And data dash is an HTML5-ism.
Yes.
You can say data dash whatever you like.
Whatever you like. It's a way of passing arbitrary data into the DOM or into the HTML so that I can get to it from JavaScript. Now, the reason I do this...
In the old days, we'd put this in a hidden text field.
You could put it in a hidden text field. That would be
anymore.
just as safe.
Well, but this is the new way.
Yeah, this is the new way. Now, I originally had done this by just emitting a JavaScript block in here and setting a variable.
Interesting.
That can be dangerous because encoding values for HTML is different to encoding values for JavaScript. And so you can do it if you know what you're doing, but this is the safer way of doing it because Razor by default encodes everything that you place into HTML with HTML encoding. I don't have to worry about some nefarious character leaking through here and ending up with a cross-site scripting exploitation or a bug in my application.
Why do you say month minus one?
The JavaScript APIs for date use a zero-based month. It's a quirk of JavaScript.
Oh, why? Okay.
Yeah, it's just a quirk. So when we look at the code here, if I go over to so keep that in mind. There's the month on the server will be 8 if it's August. But when I come to use this data in the client, which I'm doing down here.
I see also you have an array there.
I have an array there.
Well.
Down here, you'll see I'm doing, let's see if I can figure out where in this code I'm doing that. Date diff is all very logic countdown.
This is an awfully scary amount of code to do something as simple as in air quotes, as simple as
Right.
just tell them when the show is.
So here it is, get next show time, right? This is the function in my JavaScript that it creates a new date, that's a JavaScript intrinsic object. I call date.utc, which is a helper function in JavaScript to build me a date based on UTC values.
Right,
so the JavaScript knows this is a UTC date, it's not a local date. And then I grab values from the DOM for day, month, blah, blah, blah.
Remembering that is zero-based.
That here, this argument has to be zero-based. So this is the year, this is the month.
That must have been fun to learn.
I knew that from doing 20 years of web development. So I just knew that dates were zero-based here. The rest of the code in here is to do date math. Okay, so here's a date diff function that will give me a countdown object that tells me how many weeks, days, hours, minutes, and seconds there are between two dates.
And that's not something that's built into JavaScript.
That is not built into JavaScript. There are libraries that will let you do this.
But this is an interesting thing that we kind of I would say, lowercase a argued about.
Yes.
Because I said, hey, Damien, there's lovely libraries that are available. There's Moment.js.
Yes.
Everyone, we tweeted about this, and
Yep.
everyone was like, oh, Moment.js. And if I remember correctly, you looked at that and you said, that's 100K.
Yeah, that was not an insignificant amount of kilobytes for the homepage, and I was very cognizant of how much data had to be downloaded for the homepage. And then because this is a Microsoft site being hosted as a Microsoft website on a Microsoft domain, there were rules about what third-party libraries I can and can't use. And if I wanted to use a third-party library, I would have to get permission. And I was like, well, what should I do? Should I deal with legal, make a request, tell them that this site is okay to use? Or
Which
this
wouldn't
library?
be hard, but would be tedious.
It's not hard to do. I can do that. Let's be very clear. But then I wouldn't be allowed to serve that from a CDN. We don't have Moment.js on our own CDN, and so I wouldn't be able to serve that from a highly optimized server that's designed just to be able to serve static content and share that across multiple sites. I'd have to serve it from this domain. I just didn't want to do that.
So then arguably that 100K JavaScript file would be as big as the page or bigger.
Yes, exactly.
Just to do date.
Just to do date time. So I decided I can write the minimal amount of JavaScript required just to do the date math and display that I need to do. I don't need to do all types of useful human readable date stuff. I just need to do one.
You're not rewriting
Right.
a date utility.
Yep.
You need to do one thing.
One thing.
Countdown.
So in this case, I chose to spend, I think this took me 2.5 hours one night.
Okay.
From a blank JavaScript file to write how many?
Oh, and now you have that, and you should open source that.
Well, this is open source.
Oh yeah, I guess you
part of the
did.
site.
Because you open sourced the whole site.
Yeah, so this is 137 lines of code to just do, and it was a fun challenge, to just do the date stuff that I'm doing. So ultimately, this method will figure out the difference between the two dates. Using math, it's just math, right? It's just basic math to do some stuff.
Right.
And then there's some interesting code to build a human readable string based on the browser APIs. So you noted at the top there is an array of months. Yep, there's no API in JavaScript to give you friendly date formatting API in JavaScript. There are some hard-coded methods like toLocale date string and to this and to that, but you can't just pass an arbitrary format. Now, there are new APIs available in newer browsers that let you do this, but they're not always available. And so I didn't want to have to try and rely on those. I've never used them before, so I would have to learn about them. I would have to figure out when I can and can't use them.
Right.
I knew I only needed to do one string, so I just wrote enough code to do that. So there's that, and then finally, format date time. I actually do end up calling a browser API to get the local time, and then I extract out the time zone from that, so that when we go back to the home page here, you can see if I scroll, if I go back and go to the home, all the way to the top.
Now, I want to also point out while you're doing that, for people who may be listening to this and they may feel that the introduction to ASP.NET may have jumped the shark at this point.
Sure.
This is open source.
Yeah.
This is something that you can go up and you can go to github.com/ASP.net/live.asp.net.
Yep.
You can look at this code. This is living code. One of the most fun things, and I would encourage people who haven't made a production site, one of the most fun things about doing open source is doing it on a production site that you use all the time.
Absolutely.
Like we've done other sites that are less interesting, that maybe do more stuff, but we're somehow less passionate about it because we're not living with it every week.
Absolutely.
This made our jobs easier.
It did.
The existence of this site made our jobs easier, and we have the numbers to prove it.
Yeah, absolutely. We went from, 12 live viewers most weeks. We hit over 200 2 weeks after putting this site up.
Yep.
And that was after having done the show for more than 6 months.
Yep.
So we got instant return on maybe the total of 20 hours of development time I put into doing this website. So
Very, very cool.
So you can see the result here. I actually have a nice, English readable date time string, and this is coming directly from the operating system. I don't create this string. I ask the browser, please give me a locale string, and then I extract it out and rebuild this up.
Does this have any issues with English versus other non-English languages?
That's a very good question. If you are on a Japanese OS, for example, and I believe when you call that API, you will get the time zone name in Japanese, as far as I understand. And so that will come up in Japanese. But the month name won't be in Japanese because I've hard-coded that in my JavaScript.
And then I see that your seconds are counting down.
Yep.
You have a timer.
I have a timer. So that format method that I was calling down here, this one here, that returns the date diff, it returns me an object, see down here? An object that has all, how many seconds, how many weeks, how many days, how many
And
months.
then I see your toString right there.
And then here's my toString functions that let me give you the weeks, days, month, blah, 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 blah. And here's the one that's being used by the homepage. Right? If we go back, it says 5 days, 3 hours, 31 minutes, 42 seconds. That's built up by this JavaScript right here. And then that is being called on by this, countdown 2. This is the actual function that the homepage actually calls. It calls this function here. create me an interval every 500 milliseconds, calculate the date diff. So take the one from the future date, which is passed in, that's the next show date. Use the current date, give me the separation of those two things, and then show something, update the HTML to show that information in the browser. Now, the reason I do it twice a second rather than once every second, it just gives me higher accuracy.
And you don't accidentally, skip a second.
I don't absolutely skip a second.
Yeah.
It means I'd have less chance of a slip, basically. So doing it twice a second lets me do that. All right.
So I think what we'll do is we'll take a break.
Yep, absolutely.
And we'll come back. We'll look at the add to calendar feature, which is interesting because he's actually returning something that is not JavaScript, nor is it HTML. And the goal there being so that you can click add calendar and launch Outlook, which is really interesting, using a feature called Web Calendar. And that was done with some pull requests from the community.
Yeah.
Had a little bit of help.
Yep.
And then we'll also take a look at the admin page, and we'll look at a real admin page, how he logs in, and how we get data.
Yep, absolutely.
Cool.